In 1968, a massive Soviet nuclear submarine known as the K-129 mysteriously vanished into the pitch-black depths of the Pacific Ocean. When the United States military finally located the wreckage sitting in the freezing mud at a terrifying depth of 16,000 feet, they didn't just take photographs. The CIA secretly spent over $800 million constructing a massive, custom-engineered recovery ship equipped with a colossal mechanical claw to drag the destroyed submarine back to the surface. The official government narrative claims they spent almost $1 billion just to steal Soviet nuclear code, but highly classified, newly leaked metallurgical reports tell a terrifyingly different story. When the massive claw finally hauled the twisted metal out of the abyss, engineers were horrified to discover that the thick, pressure-resistant titanium hull had not imploded from a mechanical failure. It had been violently crushed and ripped open from the outside. The massive serrated puncture wound carved into the solid metal mathematically proved that the K-129 was attacked by an undocumented biological force capable of snapping a nuclear submarine completely in half. Today, we are opening the unredacted Project Azorian files and analyzing the restricted recovery photos to show you exactly what is hunting in the dark before the government permanently deletes this video. Welcome back to Project Oceana. If you think the most dangerous things on this planet are built by humans, you are about to question everything you know about the deep sea. We are going to break down the greatest cover-up in naval history, examine the impossible engineering behind a multi-billion-dollar ghost ship, and reveal the terrifying forensic evidence that proves a biological monster took down a fully armed nuclear submarine. And stay tuned, because in a few minutes, I am going to share the exact acoustic recordings captured at the moment of the attack, and the sound will chill you to the bone. To truly grasp the sheer scale of this mystery, we have to transport ourselves back to the absolute height of the Cold War. The geopolitical landscape of the 1960s was defined by a silent, underwater race for technological and cryptographic supremacy. The oceans of the world were not just bodies of water. They served as both a strategic shield and a dark graveyard for the most advanced, highly classified weaponry of the 20th century. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse, hiding weapons of mass destruction in the most inaccessible places on Earth. At the very epicenter of this clandestine underwater struggle was the Soviet submarine K-129. The K-129 was not just a standard patrol boat, it was a Project 629A, a massive vessel known by its NATO reporting name as the Golf II class. This was a diesel-electric-powered ballistic missile submarine commissioned between 1959 and 1962, and it was designed with one specific terrifying goal in mind: to provide the Soviet Union with a highly mobile, completely submerged nuclear strike capability. Unlike the nuclear-powered submarines that would later dominate naval fleets around the globe, the Golf II class relied on a complex combination of heavy diesel engines for surface travel and massive battery-powered electric motors for submerged underwater operations. This specific power setup made them incredibly quiet when running on batteries, acting like silent ghosts in the water, but they were severely limited by the constant need to surface or snorkel for air to run the diesel engine. But the Project 629A modernization was a massive technological leap forward for the Soviet Navy. They were experimenting with incredibly advanced metallurgy by employing extremely thick, high-yield steel and, according to some highly speculative technical dossiers, experimental titanium reinforcement. The Soviet engineers aimed to significantly increase the maximum navigable depth and the overall structural resilience of the pressure hull. They wanted a submarine that could dive deeper, hide better, and survive extreme atmospheric pressure. This structural evolution was absolutely essential for the deployment of their newest weapon system, the D-4 launch system. This system was an engineering marvel at the time, allowing
allowing the massive submarine to fire its 3 R-21 or SSN-5 Serb ballistic missiles while completely submerged underwater. Let's pause and talk about what that actually means. Each one of those 3 R-21 missiles carried a 1 megaton thermonuclear warhead. A single 1 megaton warhead possesses an explosive punch nearly 70 times more powerful than the weapon used to completely level Hiroshima. The K-129 was carrying 3 of them, actively patrolling the Pacific Ocean, acting as a doomsday weapon hidden beneath the wave. The submarine itself was a behemoth. It displaced over 3,500 tons of water when submerged, measured almost 330 feet in length, and required a massive crew of up to 98 highly trained personnel to operate. The hull of this underwater fortress was divided into 8 distinct sealed compartments. The massive missile tubes were located right in the center, in the 4th compartment, heavily protected within a massive elongated sail. This unique design, while perfectly functional for storing massive nuclear missiles, created a very strange hydrodynamic profile and, more importantly, a critical structural vulnerability. I want you to remember that 4th compartment because in the context of the anomalous findings we're going to look at later, the structural integrity of this exact section is the key to the entire mystery. Declassified photographs from the ocean floor later proved that the submarine split directly behind the sail, exposing the internal missile silos and the control room to extreme, catastrophic external forces. So we have a 330-foot titanium and steel fortress armed with 3 megatons of nuclear fire patrolling the dark waters of the Pacific. What could possibly go wrong? On February 24, 1968, the K-129 departed from the Ribachi Naval Base for what was supposed to be its 3rd completely routine patrol mission. The massive submarine slipped out of port, submerged into the freezing waters, and began its journey. After reaching the 180th meridian, crew sent a perfectly normal, routine check-in signal back to Fleet Command. The submarine then entered a standard strict radio silence, vanishing beneath the waves to continue its secret patrol. It never returned. When the vessel inevitably missed its next mandatory check-ins, alarm bells immediately started ringing at the highest levels of the Soviet military. The Soviet Pacific Fleet panicked. They launched a massive, desperate search and rescue operation, scrambling dozens of military ships, specialized tracking vessels, and long-range aircraft to scour the Pacific. They were searching frantically for any sign of a slick of oil, floating debris, or an emergency beacon. But despite their massive deployment of resources, the Soviet search grid was completely flawed. They centered their efforts at a location associated with the submarine's traditional, expected patrol route, completely unaware that the K-129 was nowhere near that area. They searched for weeks, burning through resources, but they were unable to locate absolutely any sign of the wreckage. The K-129, along with its 98 crew members and its apocalyptic payload, had simply ceased to exist. But while the Soviets were blindly searching empty water, the United States intelligence agencies possessed a massive, highly classified technological advantage that would change the course of history. They had the sound surveillance system, widely known as SOS-US, and the ultra-secret Air Force Technical Applications Center listening sites. This was a vast, incredibly sensitive global network of underwater hydrophone, basically massive underwater microphones, placed strategically along the ocean floor to secretly track every single Soviet submarine movement across the globe. These hydrophone networks, specifically working in tandem with the massive ADOC SOS-US array located in the Aleutian Island, detected something extremely disturbing. On March 8, 1968, exactly when the K-129 went missing, the listening stations recorded a massive, violent acoustic event. I want to take a second here. Imagine sitting in a dark, classified listening post, wearing heavy headphones, listening to the ambient noise of the Pacific Ocean. ocean. Suddenly, your meters absolutely spike. You hear the deafening, horrific sound of metal screaming, twisting, and failing under immense pressure. Acoustic analysts reviewed the tapes and identified a series of sharp, incredibly violent sounds that were perfectly consistent with a catastrophic hull breach and a subsequent devastating implosion. Using advanced geometry and triangulating these terrifying acoustic signals from 4 different Air Force technical application centers, the United States Navy was able to locate the exact position of the wreck on the ocean floor. They narrowed it down to an astonishingly small 5 nautical mile radius and a level of underwater tracking precision that was completely unheard of and thought impossible in the 1960s.
The Americans knew exactly where the Soviet nuclear submarine was, and the Soviets had absolutely no idea. But what actually caused a heavily reinforced, state-of-the-art submarine to instantly die? Over the decades, historical hypotheses for the loss of the K-129 have varied wildly. The official Soviet version eventually settled on the theory of a mechanical snorkel failure. They proposed that freezing seawater forcefully entered the pressure hull through a faulty, broken snorkel valve while the submarine was navigating heavy, violent seas on the surface. This flooding, they claim, caused the submarine to rapidly sink, exceed its maximum crush depth, and completely collapse under the weight of the ocean. Another popular theory pointed to a catastrophic hydrogen battery explosion. The massive lead-acid batteries used in the Project 629A submarine naturally release highly explosive hydrogen gas while they are being charged. If the internal ventilation and venting system failed for even a few minutes, a single electrical spark could have easily triggered a massive, catastrophic internal explosion, blowing the submarine apart from the inside out. Then there was the collision theory. For years, Soviet authorities deeply suspected that an American attack submarine, specifically the USS Swordfish, had violently collided with the K-129 in the dark. Adding fuel to this fire, the USS Swordfish actually arrived at a naval base in Japan on March 17th, just days after the K-129 sank. With a severely bent periscope and significant damage, the United States military quickly attributed this damage to a collision with an ice pack, but the timing was incredibly suspicious. But we need to talk about the fourth theory, the theory the government doesn't want you to know about, the biological predation hypothesis. When forensic audio experts recently re-evaluated the original unredacted acoustic data from the SOUS network, they found something that makes the mechanical failure theories completely fall apart. Independent analysts pointed to a distinct, highly unusual, low-frequency signature that occurred immediately preceding the sounds of the implosion. This low-frequency rumble was incredibly similar to the infamous bloop anomaly recorded by the NOAA years later, a massive underwater sound that some highly respected cryptobiologists attribute to large, undocumented, predatory marine life. Something massive was moving near the K-129 right before it died. The United States Navy couldn't just rely on acoustic data. They needed to see it with their own eye. In August 1968, the highly advanced nuclear attack submarine, the USS Halibut, was secretly dispatched to the exact coordinates triangulated by the listening station. The wreck was sitting in the freezing, crushing dark at a staggering depth of 16,500 feet. To get visuals, the USS Halibut deployed a massive towed sensor sled loaded with extremely powerful strobe lights, high-resolution cameras, and advanced sonar arrays. This piece of secret technology was informally known among the crew simply as the Fish. The Halibut slowly dragged this massive camera sled back and forth across the abyssal plain, eventually capturing over 20,000 highly classified, terrifyingly clear close-up photographs of the dead K-129. What
What those 20,000 images revealed sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the CIA. The massive submarine was lying completely on its side, resting in the deep mud, violently broken into 3 distinct pieces. The most significant split, the complete structural failure, occurred directly behind the massive conning tower, right where the nuclear missiles were housed. But here is the detail that changes everything. Crucially, the extreme high-resolution photographs clearly showed that the thick titanium and steel hull wasn't merely crushed inward by the extreme hydrostatic pressure of the deep ocean. When a submarine implodes, it crushes like a tin can, buckling inward in predictable mathematical patterns. But the K-129 didn't look like that. It exhibited distinct, massive, uneven tears and highly unusual serrated punctures that completely defied all known laws and predictable patterns of standard hydrostatic failure. Something tore it open. The CIA now had a monumental problem, but also an impossible opportunity. The discovery of the shattered K-129 resting 3 miles deep offered what they called an intelligence gold mine. If the CIA could somehow manage the impossible task of recovering the massive forward section of the submarine, they would gain unrestricted physical access to the highly classified Soviet code room, the Advanced Missile Control Center, and the fully armed nuclear-tipped torpedoes. In 1970, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger sat down with President Richard Nixon and officially proposed what is arguably the insane, clandestine engineering recovery plan in human history. This impossible mission, completely classified from the public, was codenamed Project Azorian. President Nixon formally approved the operation, fully understanding there was an extremely high probability of catastrophic failure, global embarrassment. The estimated financial cost was absolutely staggering, quickly escalating to consume eventually $800 million of untraceable government money. To put that into perspective, when adjusted for inflation, that is the equivalent of roughly $4.7 billion today. Let me say that again, nearly $5 billion. This astronomical expenditure represents one of the single most significant, massive allocations of black budget fund in the entire history of the Cold War. This immediate allocation of billions of dollars raises a massive, glaring question. Why was the highly risky recovery of a single, severely damaged, aging diesel-electric submarine violently prioritized over dozens of delicate, far more pressing strategic intelligence needs? The government claims it was for codebook, but codebooks expire. Technology becomes obsolete. You don't spend $5 billion just to look at an old radio. You spend $5 billion when you find something at the bottom of the ocean that terrifies you. The CIA immediately ran into a massive logistical hurdle. They had to build the largest, most bizarre recovery ship the world had ever seen, and they had to do it in plain sight without the Soviet Union asking questions. They required a completely airtight, plausible cover story to explain the construction of this massive, unique engineering marvel. They turned to the one man, eccentric and rich enough to pull it off, the legendary billionaire Howard Hughes. Hughes was a brilliant aviation pioneer, a notorious recluse, and a man with a long, secretive history of closely collaborating on highly classified defense and intelligence projects. The CIA's Project Azorian used the massive Hughes Glomar Explorer, publicly disguised as a deep-sea manganese mining vessel, to recover a sunken Soviet submarine. Costing $350 million, the 619-foot ship, built in Pennsylvania, featured a secret moon pool and massive steel doors. This allowed the submarine to be pulled entirely inside, hidden from Soviet surveillance. To conceal the retrieval claw, nicknamed Clementine, it was built submerged in a secondary vessel, the HMB-1 Bard, and secretly loaded into the Glomar Explorer's moon pool underwater. The engineering task was immense, rivaling the Apollo mission. The ship had to remain perfectly simply stationary over the recovery site, 16,500 feet below, accomplished by a pioneering dynamic positioning system utilizing acoustic transponders and automatic thrusters. The lifting mechanism involved painstakingly connecting 9 miles of heavy steel pipe, at the end of which hung the colossal Clementine claw. Clementine was designed with powerful hydraulic grappling arms to cradle the damaged K-129 hull. Crucially, the claw was made of maraging steel, an extremely strong but brittle alloy, prone to fracturing under sudden, uneven stress. The use of this specific, less ductile material suggests the engineers prioritized raw gripping power and anticipated overcoming active resistance or punching through a tough biological substance encasing the wreckage, adding a biological dimension to the Oceanus anomaly.
They built a steel trap to catch a monster. Real quick, let me know in the comments if you would ever volunteer to sit on a ship lowering a 9-mile steel pipe into the absolute unknown dark of the ocean, knowing there are live nuclear weapons waiting at the bottom. The tension must have been completely suffocating. The massive salvage operation finally commenced in the summer of 1974. The Hughes Glomar Explorer lumbered into position and arrived exactly at the recovery site on July 4th, 1974. For over 2 grueling, terrifying months, the dedicated crew fought off massive, violent typhoon and punishing tropical storm. But the weather wasn't their only problem. They were operating under the constant, highly aggressive surveillance of the Soviet Navy. The Soviet military tugboat SB-10 and the heavily instrumented naval ship Chazma constantly harassed and monitored the Glomar Explorer incredibly closely. At some terrifying points, the massive Soviet ships aggressively maneuvered to within a mere 75 yards of the American vessel, nearly causing an international incident. Despite the intense paranoia, the Glomar Explorer's crew maintained their absolute discipline and their fabricated cover story. They visibly pretended to conduct standard, boring manganese mining tests, completely fooling the Soviets. They even went so far as to proudly present a fake manganese nodule permanently encased in a block of clear lucite to curious visitors and foreign personnel. In August 1974, the Glomar Explorer's Clementine claw successfully grappled the crushed forward section of the Soviet submarine K-129, 9 miles deep. The agonizingly slow lift proceeded flawless day, hauling the section 2 miles up. At roughly 9,000 to 10,000 feet, the mission catastrophically failed. Several custom-built maraging steel grappling arms snapped, causing 2/3 of the recovered section, including the conning tower, missile compartment with 3 thermonuclear missiles, and control room, to break free and plummet back down. The CIA lost its $5 billion prize. The crew managed to recover only a 38-foot forward section, which contained the torpedo compartment. The official salvage summary reports recovering this section: 2 armed nuclear torpedoes, the remains of 6 submariners, and limited cryptographic document. Crucially, it noted anomalous finding, high-level plutonium contamination, and massive, unexplainable serrated punctures. While the official explanation cites standard brittle fracture for the lift failure, suppressed Oceanus theory and eyewitness accounts suggest a violent scenario. When the section was brought up, engineers found the reinforced titanium and steel hull riddled with massive, deeply serrated puncture wounds, not typical crush damage. Forensic analysis concluded the damage was not from a collision or internal explosion, but suggested a violent biological origin: massive teeth or claw-like appendages. The math implies a biological monster capable of exerting bite pressure far exceeding the hull's yield strength, essentially crushing a nuclear submarine. Suddenly, the insane, astronomical $800 million
price tag of Project Azorian makes terrifying sense. It becomes completely understandable if the primary, highly classified mission wasn't simply to steal old nuclear secrets, but to actively recover the remains of an unknown, massive biological entity that had violently attacked a nuclear-armed military vessel. The CIA's intense, well-documented interest in exploring advanced black technology often extended far beyond mechanical engineering, deeply diving into extremely high-risk, completely unregulated biological and xenological field, and the evidence of the attack only gets worse. Classified reports heavily leaked from the recovery deck indicated a terrifying detail about the nuclear weapon. The recovered nuclear torpedoes had suffered what experts call one-point detonation. This is a highly specific phenomenon where the sensitive high explosive inside the warhead are heavily compromised by extreme sudden physical deformation. This specific damage profile suggests something unbelievable. It mathematically suggests that whatever massive entity attacked the K-129 was incredibly strong enough to physically crush the solid steel torpedo tube from the absolute outside, violently crushing the nuclear weapons inside while the sub was still operating at extreme depth. The catastrophic external hull breach of the sunken Soviet submarine, evidenced by severe damage and scattered plutonium, suggests an incredibly violent external attack, not a mechanical failure. The classified Oceanus framework posits that the official narrative of the Clementine Claw failure was a deliberate cover-up to conceal the successful recovery of massive non-mechanical biological specimens attached to the wreckage. This successful disinformation campaign prevented the Soviet Union from investigating the biological anomaly. The public exposure of Project Azorian began violently in February 1975 with the suspicious burglary of classified documents linking Howard Hughes, the Glomar Explorer, and the CIA's secret attempt to raise a Soviet nuclear submarine. After the story leaked to the press, CIA Director William Colby's appeals to suppress the story failed, leading to a massive diplomatic crisis for the Ford administration. To manage the situation without admitting international piracy, the CIA's legal team invented the Glomar response, the doctrine of neither confirm nor deny the existence of record, in response to Freedom of Information Act requests. This legal phrasing, born from this incident, remains a standard tool for government agencies to protect classified activity. Project Azorian was terminated in June 1975. The Soviets, aware of the U.S.'s capability, permanently stationed a heavily armed guard ship over the K-129 wreck, leading to the cancellation of the follow-up project Matador. Despite the publicity, Project Azorian remains a monumental engineering feat of the 20th century, advancing deep-sea salvage technology like dynamic positioning systems. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, later GSF Explorer, had a second life as a deep-water drill ship from 1998 to 2015 before being scrapped in 2015. The question of the biological threat, what ripped open a nuclear submarine, persists. The Oceanus name has resurfaced in modern, highly funded scientific projects, suggesting a continued, urgent, and classified need to monitor the massive biological anomaly first discovered in 1974. The retrieval of the K-129 was a defining Cold War moment, but the horrific, massive serrated puncture wounds in the hull, combined with the exorbitant financial investment, suggest the mission's true terrifying scope remains classified. If the suppressed Oceanus metallurgical findings are accurate, Project Azorian was not just espionage, but the first undeniable government encounter with a violent, massive abyssal biology that challenges our understanding of the deep ocean. The K-129 was violently intercepted and destroyed by biological forces representing the unknown and unknowable dark frontier of our planet. As advanced autonomous vessels like the modern Oceanus map the abyss, they may eventually rediscover what the Clementine Claw first grasped. There are powerful entities in the dark deep, and the government spent billions to find and bury the evidence.